let the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable in your sight, O Lord. Please be seated. In our gospel reading this morning, we see that Jesus is continuing his journey. Today's gospel message actually appears in 3 of the 4 gospels, each gospel making mention of the dispute among the disciples and a question arising out of that dispute that they posed to Jesus. Who is the greatest among you? It's this question that will be the focus of my reflection this morning. It's a question that's worthy of the wisdom of Jesus, as we heard about that wisdom in the Epistle of James, as he taught the important lessons of life to the disciples and to each of us today. In today's lesson, his response to their question, who is the greatest among you, seems quite simplistic, yet complex as we consider that response in its totality. But first, let's look at the setting. Jesus and the disciples had just passed through Galilee. The scripture said Jesus did not want anyone to know where they were going because he was still teaching his disciples. In this setting, he is about to teach the disciples several things, and some quite possibly difficult to understand. He wanted his time with his disciples for his instruction for them. Had others known where they were going, we can only imagine the crowds would want to assemble. The chances of a gathering around Jesus would have been quite likely, but he needed this time with his disciples, for they had much to learn from him. The first start of his interaction with them on this part of the trip was to remind them of the future. The Son of Man is going to be betrayed into the hands of men. They will kill him, and after 3 days, he will rise. This was Christ's second time to give this prediction of his impending death and his resurrection. The disciples still didn't understand this, and they were afraid to ask him about it. After all, they were expecting a Messiah, one that would be a reigning king, not one that would be killed and then rise from the dead. But as they continued on to Capernaum, instead of addressing his impending death with them again, we learn that the disciples were having an argument, a dispute. Jesus asked them, "What are you arguing about on the road?" They were quiet because they were arguing about who was the greatest among them. We can only imagine that argument, because each one of those disciples could have boasted about many things in their argument about who was the greatest. I can only imagine how that might have gone. Peter could argue he was Jesus' appointed leader upon whom Jesus decided to build his church. Naturally, he could be considered the greatest. Andrew could argue he was the first disciple that Jesus called. He was the one who, after all, introduced Peter to Jesus. And then there was Matthew. He might argue that he made the greatest sacrifice to be a disciple by abandoning his tax collector role to follow Jesus. And I could go on and on. We've all been in situations where people have bragged about their rights, about why they did the best work. All you have to do is be a teacher or be a principal of a school, and you can hear how boastful we can be, and it also carries on into that adulthood that we leave. But Jesus, being the teacher he was, didn't focus on who did what or who was who. He decided not to directly answer the question or even to reprimand them for the argument itself, wondering why they weren't talking again about his prediction, but to make it a teachable moment. For a teacher in education, we love those teachable moments. It's that time that we have to explain something that we're trying to get across to others, to teach a principle, a concept, at a particular time or even a peculiar moment. Jesus had such a teachable moment when he finds out they were arguing over who was the greatest of them. So in Jesus' style, he had them come to sit down with them, and he starts. If anyone wants to be the first, he must be the last and the servant of all. He follows this by taking a little child and having that child stand among them. Whoever welcomes one of these little children in my name welcomes me, and whoever welcomes me does not welcome me, but welcomes the one who sent me. So in contrast to their argument about who was the greatest, he uses a child as a symbol who has no authority, is completely vulnerable, and powerless. Jesus will say later that we must come like a child to enter the kingdom of heaven. In his response, he also continues to serve as an advocate for the one who sent him when he says, if you welcome him, meaning Jesus, you are extending your welcome to God, the one who had sent him. So what is it about the state of greatness that we can learn from the teachings of Christ? True greatness is to serve others. True greatness is not about a title, a position, an office, fame, ability, academic degrees, great success, or positions of power. So what does it mean to be a servant? One only needs to look at the life of Christ, his examples. In Mark 10:15, he describes himself as a servant. When he was sent to live and walk among us, he modeled for us and for others that servanthood. He interacted with people wherever he went, working to meet their needs, the needs of the people, from healing to teaching to feeding the multitudes. And one of the most vivid examples he gives us of his servanthood took place during the Last Supper, when he humbled himself to wash the feet of the disciples, something that we reenact each year during Holy Week, reminding us of a servant's attitude and the service of God to others. Servanthood is a timeless concept. We saw in our epistle by James, to show by your good life that your works are done with gentleness, born of wisdom, the wisdom that comes to us as we are servant leaders. Christ was preparing his disciples to be the leaders of the early church after his death and resurrection. We have much in our world today that we read about servant leadership. It's become quite popular in the leadership realms. It was coined in the academic world as the servant as leader by Robert Greenleaf in an essay that he published in 1970. In that essay, he wrote this: "The servant leader is servant first. It begins with the natural feeling that one wants to serve first. Then conscious choice brings one to aspire to lead. That person is sharply different from one who is leader first, perhaps for their need for title, for power, or drive to acquire material possessions. The leader first and the servant first are two extreme types, Between them, he continues, are shades and blends that are part of the infinite variety of human nature. My career has focused on leadership roles, leadership studies, and preparing others to want to be and aspire to leadership positions, to help others, to serve others as their primary mission. And I'm blessed to continue that work today in different settings. As I work with groups whose members come from across an organization or an institution where they hold all levels of responsibility and different titles, I ask them, leave that title and your responsibilities at the door as you walk in and we begin our sessions. This is a way to illustrate the fact that greatness is not about our titles, it's not about our degrees. And at first it's uncomfortable for some to do this. Those who have higher titles and degrees and those who do not. Many come feeling that they are less than others, and others come with an air about themselves. We work diligently to build a culture of mutual respect and one of servant leadership as we interact with each other on a daily basis. And at the end of the work, the most common comment is not about those fantastic theories that I shared with them, but it's about the relationships that they built with each other that will carry over time, regardless of what their work is. Servanthood is not about power or holding power over others. We are reminded again of that in James. Where there is envy and selfish ambition, there will also be disorder and wickedness of every kind. Servanthood is giving of ourselves to others, and a true servant leader does not sow disorder, discord, and wickedness everywhere they go. There's a sense of genuine empathy within a servant that sows peace and harmony. We may assume roles of power and authority in our work, in our community activities, in our church, but it's not our authority in those roles, but it's our willingness to serve others through those roles that will result in us meeting our ultimate goals. No person is without an opportunity to serve. Each of us has an opportunity to serve as we walk and serve as Jesus did. We simply only need to come to him as little children and welcome him and the one who sent him into our hearts. By our actions, All Saints Parish could be considered an example of servanthood in action as we serve others in our community, whether it be through Neighbor's Table, our youth programs, our corporate prayer with other churches, our engagement with the tech community in reaching out to students, and so many other things that we do to serve each other and our community. But here's a caution. Servanthood is not a to-do list to check off what we have done to serve. It is a genuine walk and talk with God and willingness to be his servant. The opportunities will be there for us. Having the wisdom to know when to serve becomes a priority within our walk. All Saints exhibits the greatness as Jesus defined it and taught his disciples as we continue to serve one another. The question then is not who is the greatest among us, but what is our service to others? God bless each of you as you continue in your ministry of service. Amen.